All right. In a glorious start to this, should this thing be working right now? Possibly not. Okay, I'm going to stand right here. Hey, so thanks very much for coming along to the session today, and we appreciate your time. Obviously, the session today is Site Recovery with Citrix Essentials for Hyper-V. My name is Bede Hackney. I work for Citrix Systems, so I take care of our server virtualization and networking technologies for Australia and New Zealand. I'll be joined today, in fact, the bulk of today's session will be delivered by Daniel Pendlebury. Daniel's actually joined Citrix quite recently, and he's our lead SE for server virtualization, also focusing on the New Zealand and Australian markets. Give this thing another test. Not so much. All right. Look at that. There we go. Okay, so sorry about that. I wanted to start this session before we get into too much detail and talk a little bit about the partnership that Citrix and Microsoft have enjoyed. As many of you probably know, it's a partnership that's been around for 20 plus years now. And in fact, if you know a little bit about Citrix, you'll know that pretty much our whole business is based on this partnership. So literally, or essentially, all of our products are focused on enhancing and extending the functionality of the great Microsoft products. So things like our flagship products, if you're aware of Zen App and Zen Desktop, which are all about virtualization of Windows-based applications and Windows-based desktops. Again, all about enhancing and extending the underlying Windows or Microsoft technology. You might also be aware that we've got partnership with Microsoft in several other markets. So WAN optimization is a great example. For those of you who are familiar with WAN optimization, you might know that Citrix is one of the few vendors who offer a branch office box that is designed to deliver everything a branch requires, which we think is a combination of Windows Server and WAN acceleration technology from Citrix. That's our Windows branch repeater. So that's one example of the partnership. Another example, actually something we're excited about next month, is we're taking what is the industry-leading load balancer, being Citrix NetScaler, and we're virtualizing it. So next month we're releasing a virtual edition of the NetScaler that will run on top of Hyper-V. Another example of that partnership. The session today, of course, however, is about how we enhance and extend the functionality of Hyper-V with Citrix Essentials for Hyper-V. So a quick agenda. I'm going to share with you guys for about 10 minutes just a bit of a background on the virtualization space. I'll hand over to Daniel, who's going to drill into Essentials for Hyper-V in a little more detail. We'll finish up with a summary, and we should have time at the end for Q&A as well. Look at that. We got it working. It's a beautiful thing. So we take a step back. We've talked about the partnership between Microsoft and Citrix. If we talk a little bit about the adoption of virtualization over time, I think most people would agree that there's been several phases of virtualization. So the first phase was about recognizing the opportunity that virtualization represented in our data centers. And I think most organizations have clearly gone through that. We all, I think, appreciate the opportunity. That's why so many of you are here today. A lot of organizations, I think, are now in what I'd call phase two, which is consolidation. So when I talk about consolidation, I'm talking about taking a lot of tier 2 applications, or lovingly referred to as crap applications, and consolidating them onto a virtual environment and taking advantage of that. So that's phase two, and I think there's still a lot of organizations who are in that consolidation phase of their virtualization path. But I think increasingly organizations are starting to get into phase three. And phase three is really about agility from a Citrix standpoint. So phase three is about now taking, instead of just tier 2 applications, we'll now take tier 1 applications and we'll deploy them in a virtual environment. We'll do that because of some of the benefits we get from an agility standpoint, things like HA, things like disaster recovery, that we can leverage more completely in a virtual environment. So in my humble opinion, most organizations have gone through the recognize phase. A lot of organizations are either still in the consolidation phase or have come through that and are now starting to look at virtualization for agility. I think I'd suggest that there's very few organizations that have actually taken that to its next step, which is all about a dynamic data center. So when we talk about a dynamic data center, what we mean is a data center that has orchestration technology that can sense changes in server workload, changes in user path and workload there as well, and actually react to that in a dynamic fashion without operator intervention. So I think, this is an interesting topic because I think a lot of organizations need to go down that path, particularly if you have an interest in leveraging cloud. When you start to talk about cloud and particularly infrastructure as a service, the theory here is that if you haven't got a dynamic data center in your own environment, if you haven't got your own environment to a point where you can move workloads around, provision and deprovision based on changing environment or changing workloads, then how can you actually start to do that in a cloud? Particularly, again, when you drill into cloud bursting into infrastructure as a service type scenarios, if you're unable to have that level of flexibility and that level of dynamic data center within your administrative control, that's going to be a challenge to implement outside your administrative control. So I'd suggest that there's very few organizations that have actually got to that point, but I think that's certainly the path that the majority of the industry is heading down. So if we touch on briefly some of the challenges from a virtualization standpoint and some of the things that have been inhibitors to us moving from phase to phase, some of the things that we think are particularly key are the challenges with disaster recovery, particularly when you talk about disaster recovery when you're trying to leverage complex storage technology to achieve that. One of the other really big challenges we think with server virtualization is how you manage a lab and staging environment, how you try and avoid particularly server sprawl in that type of environment. So these are just some of the things that we think have acted as inhibitors as we try and progress through those phases. So Citrix released a little over a year ago Essentials for Hyper-V. And at the time when we did, we actually looked at how can we enhance, how can we extend Hyper-V. And so this is one of the graphs that we looked at a little bit in that process, which was, I don't know if you can see the detail, but it was taken in March. It's a survey that was done in March of last year. It was over 300 respondents. And the question was, what are your key virtualization initiatives for 2009? And there's no, if you can make it out, there's no great surprises in the first couple of answers. People want to put more physical platforms into their virtual environment. People want to take more applications and put them into their virtual environment. So no great surprises in the top two responses, but where from a Citrix standpoint it got interesting was the next four. So the next four responses are all about how do I manage disaster recovery, how do I manage replication, how do I manage lab and stage type virtualization applications, how do I take advantage of those things in a virtual environment. So when it came to Essentials for Hyper-V, these are the areas we focused on. And so specifically, Citrix Essentials for Hyper-V delivers four key areas of technology. The first one, as you can see, is provisioning server. Daniel's going to talk about each of these in a little more detail, but at a high level, provisioning server is the idea of being able to provision and deprovision servers in real time, and at the same time leverage single instancing. So the concept there is, and if we take an example of an IIS server, in our data center what we want to have is a single gold image of an IIS server that can be dynamically provisioned or indeed deprovisioned, leveraging that one single image but then applying that IIS server to a specific function. So that's what provisioning server is, and Daniel's going to talk about it a little bit more. Provisioning server is built on to deliver what we call Lab and Stage Manager. Lab and Stage Manager, as I said before, it's all about managing server sprawl or VM sprawl in a test and dev environment. It's also about creating a self-service portal for the provisioning of test and dev VMs. So that's the focus there. Those two things now come together as Workflow Studio. So Workflow Studio is Citrix's offering in the data center orchestration space. It's based on PowerShell. And so Workflow Studio takes input from both Citrix technology and third-party technology, leveraging PowerShell integration. And it allows you to analyze that, script responses to that analysis, and then output that back into, again, either Citrix technology or third-party technology. But the final of the areas of technical focus is a technology we call Storage Link. And again, this is where Daniel's going to spend most of his time talking about Storage Link. Also at a high level though, Storage Link is about unlocking the sophisticated functionality that exists in your storage technology when you bring that into a virtual environment. As many of you will know, when we take our expensive and again sophisticated SANs and we plug them into a virtualized environment, what we often end up with is the hypervisor taking control of the access to that storage, and you essentially end up with a lump of hard disk. Right? All of those sophisticated pieces of functionality that you paid for are now blocked simply because we've switched to a virtualization environment. So StorageLink is actually the result of a partnership between Citrix and a number of the key sort of storage vendors to unlock that functionality. So we're working with an open standard-based communication between the hypervisor and the storage equipment to unlock dedupe, to unlock snapshotting at a storage level. Again, Daniel will drill into that. So actually, let me just, before I hand over to Daniel, run through a really quick example. This is one of what could be several thousand examples of how data center orchestration or a dynamic data center might sense and respond. So in this example, we've got on the right-hand side four virtual servers. Let's call them IIS servers for the sake of the discussion. We've got some networking fabric that might be both physical and virtual in the middle, and then obviously we've got our users coming in from the left-hand side. Down in the bottom left, we've got our Workflow Studio server, which exists in the data center. So in this example, for whatever reason, our IIS servers are experiencing load. You know, there's a new news release, we've pushed out a new message to our internal employees, whatever the case may be, we've got unforecast load on our IIS servers that's negatively impacting user performance, right? So in this example, we've got multiple tools that can detect that load. We've got server tools and we've also got networking tools that can detect that load and then feed that information into Workflow Studios. Once that comes into Workflow Studios, it can run through predefined scripts that say, you know, hey, actually we want to achieve a high level of service for that IIS-based application. So in the event of poor performance, have Workflow Studios talk to System Center, dynamically provision another instance of our single image IIS server, potentially dynamically provision virtual networking, at the very least incorporate the new IIS server into our networking policies and rules, and then bring that server back into the acceptable performance statistics. Right, so as I said, just one example of how data center orchestration can come together, but I think it ties provisioning server and it ties Workflow Studio into that environment. I don't have the animation built here, but what it could equally do is now detect when that load goes back to the forecast level and actually deprovision that server that it's spun up, or in fact more servers. So look, with that, I'm going to hand over to Daniel to go through the majority of the more technical content here, and I'll come back at the end.
Thanks, Bede. Thanks for your time today, guys. As Bede's mentioned, I'm just going to cover off the main portions of Citrix Essentials for Hyper-V. As you can see on the slide here, it's not a replacement product for putting into your environment. It's more of a complementary product working with System Center and obviously Hyper-V as well. So you can see on the slide here that we've got storage integration through StorageLink. We've got on-demand provisioning and workloads through like Provisioning Server, workflow orchestration through Workflow Studio, and obviously site recovery, which is the main thing that we're going to cover off today. Obviously fully integrating with System Center. So I'm just briefly going to touch on some of the points that Bede mentioned earlier. As far as lifecycle management, this is more the lab and stage manager type of area. It's mainly about dynamically provisioning servers for a test or a dev environment, bringing them up, managing them from a user perspective or a development lifecycle, and then spinning them down and getting them out of your environment so you can return your resources back to more essential resources. Dynamic provisioning is basically about managing your storage and, as Bede mentioned earlier, about streaming down gold images to not just virtual machines but also physical machines. And with it, integration into System Center, you can actually stream down hypervisors down to bare metal as well to actually increase your load or capabilities to handle that load. Workflow orchestration, as Bede mentioned earlier, is about managing a response to issues within the data center. This mainly ties in with PowerShell and other types of scripting products out there. So things like, okay, I need a new IIS server, for example. The workflow for that would be spin up the IIS server, bring it into the network, join it to the domain, put it into this pool, and bring it into the environment. All of that can be totally automated with zero effort on your behalf. But the main thing here to talk about today is obviously storage link and site recovery. The way that this actually works, and the main reason why we've developed this in conjunction with Microsoft, is to kind of release the ability of the SAN controllers and the investment that you've made into your storage environment. So rather than try and manage it and get our hooks into the controller hardware and take away that functionality that you've already bought and paid for, we just pass the commands through to the SAN controllers and the storage controllers to let them do what they do best, which is clone, snap, dedupe, replicate, HA, and so on. The good thing is it actually works with any type of storage, whether it be NAS, SAN, and direct attach is actually coming in later on or early next year. So just a bit of a brief overview on actually how the issues that you have. Traditionally, DR, actually getting it to work in your environment, it's very hard to actually test, design, and even harder to actually execute it because it's very hard to release that storage. And another thing as well is it actually becomes very expensive because you're actually licensing that type of storage or site recovery on top of the products that you've already bought and paid for through the SAN vendors. So what is it basically? We can see down here, down the bottom, we've got our SAN controllers from a couple of vendors here. We've got our hypervisors up the top with a couple of VMs on either side. We've got a designated primary site and a secondary site over here, all being managed from the central console. So what do you actually get? You get a very affordable disaster recovery solution because it's quite cheap, which Bede will go through in a later slide. It's very easy to use, it's very easy to configure, it's all totally wizard driven, so there's not a lot of things that can go wrong. And as I mentioned before, it actually uses array-based replication, so all of the stuff that you've bought and paid for with the SAN vendors, we're just passing through commands and leveraging those storage controllers and all the effort that those vendors have put in to getting things up and running, like high availability and replication between the sites. So what actually happens in the end is if we have a failure at the primary site, site recovery will actually automate the failover, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So how do we actually configure it? You can see here we've got our storage down the bottom, we've got our Hyper-V servers with a couple of virtual machines on there, and then we've got a storage link based at each site. Now, storage link is actually licensed per host, not guest. Which also makes it a very cheap solution as well. So how do you actually configure it? Now, we're not actually in storage link at the moment. We're still just at a SAN level. So we designate the primary and secondary arrays. So this is all through your SAN controller. So we've designated our storage repositories at each site. We've designated this as a primary and this as a secondary. And then we get into storage link. So we actually protect and map which bits of these that we want to protect at each site. And then what we actually do is we then link storage link into that, and what it actually does is it'll verify the VM of the primary site, and it will see through the SAN controller, the primary site, that it is replicated across to the secondary, and that it can see the VMs there, and it's happy. And it really is that easy. So the other type of functionality that you can get out of site recovery and storage link is the ability to test your DR quite easily. What you can actually do is, on the secondary site, you've already got your managed storage repositories, your virtual machines, which are mapped and protected through site recovery. And you can actually snap it out through the SAN controller, so it's zero effort, and it takes away from the hypervisor any type of load that would do, so it's all done through the SAN controller. Bring it up in an isolated environment within the secondary site, test it, make sure everything's working, and then once you're happy, it's all done. And it obviously has no effect on replication at all whatsoever because you're just talking to the storage level. And when it's done, the VMs are discarded. So the issue that we've had previously, or not that we've had, but that you do have at a secondary site, is how do you recover in a defined and repeatable way when you do have an issue at the primary site? So there's no use bringing up your application servers or your SQL servers if you've got no DNS, no DHCP or no Active Directory servers there for authentication or anything like that to work. So what you can actually do through things like Workflow Studio is designate the order in which the VMs come up. So you can have the servers come up in a certain order. Now this is not just dependent on the virtual machine, it's actually service and application aware. So you can say, if my DNS isn't up and working, wait until that's up and then bring up my Active Directory servers. And then SQL and the apps further on down the track. Failing back to a primary site. Now this has historically been an issue for some other hypervisors out there, as well as from a licensing perspective, which I'm sure everyone's probably had issues with. Thankfully, the licensing's all been taken care of now. And with Storage Link, we've actually got the ability that, because we're not controlling it, we're just passing through the commands to the SAN controller. It's all managed by them, and it works quite nicely and quite quickly as well. So you can see here, once the primary site's back up, after you've had your failure, reverse the replication. So that's just a Storage Link command through to the SAN controller to reverse the replication back. Once that's completed, you can validate your primary setup through either Workflow Studio or through manual testing yourself. Once you're happy with that, click the failback button, and then it will automatically pass a command to the SAN controller to resume replication the correct way. And you're not tied down to restoring to the primary site. You can actually restore to a different site if needed, assuming the SAN controller supports it and you've got the replication and everything licensed through your SAN controllers and storage vendors. So this just basically covers off the type of disaster recovery solutions that we can actually bring to the market currently. The two that we can deliver today is the large and medium enterprise. They are tied down to shared storage. The small enterprise and branch office, which talks about direct attached storage, is actually due for Q1 next year. That's the January quarter. And then that will allow for smaller types of site recovery as needed. And once again, obviously, your replication, your interconnects and your failover, if that's all licensed through your SAN vendors, then it's no additional cost for you guys. So I might hand back to Bede to do a bit of a summary, and then we'll do some Q&A for the new guy.
Indeed. All right, thanks, Daniel. Hey, so that's really just, a primer on essentials for Hyper-V. I guess I just wanted to sort of come up and summarise and talk a little bit about the commercial models that are available. So, again, really there's 4 areas of technology that we bring to a Hyper-V-based virtual environment. Provisioning server, lab and stage management, Storage Link, and Workflow Studios are essentially the technologies. Probably where it gets a little bit interesting is a pretty common question that you get when you're a Citrix guy talking about essentials for Hyper-V is, how does it stack up? How does the joint solution between Microsoft and Citrix stack up against the other, major solution in the market, which is the folks at VMware? And so, that's a conversation that's worth having both technically and commercially. From a technical standpoint, it's our position that the combination of the features you get from System Center, the features you get from Hyper-V, and the features you get from Essentials for Hyper-V actually surpasses the functionality you get from VMware, and specifically in the way that it integrates into System Center and your other management applications, in addition to the replication configuration or the automated process thereof. So, we also have, of course, array-level replication, DR validation that Daniel talked through, and failover staging. So, we think from a functionality standpoint, it's got all of those functions covered as in addition to probably better integration into your Microsoft environment. So from a technical standpoint, we think it's a strong solution. Commercially, and this is where it becomes really interesting, is commercially the solution from both Microsoft and Citrix tends to run out at less than 1/3 of the cost of an equivalent VMware based solution. And I don't know if you can make it out there, but this example is actually for a 50-host environment. You can see at the top there the breakdown of the number of processes per server and how we've licensed that out.
In there, A lot of people, I get asked this question all the time, is why is the solution so much cheaper than the VMware solution? But what you have to realise is that in the VMware solution, you've got all your Windows Server licensing and everything as well, whereas with the Citrix and Microsoft solution, especially for Hyper-V, is your hypervisor licensing is already included with the server licensing, hence the rather big difference there.
Yep. In fact, it's probably worth saying that we've done a number of examples with customers where their maintenance renewal on their existing hypervisor technology is actually dearer than the cost to roll out a new solution based on Citrix and Microsoft. So look, the last slide from me, and we've intentionally left a bit of time here for Q&A at the end of the session. The last slide here is just a discussion about the different editions that we offer Essentials for Hyper-V in. So you get Express, Enterprise and Platinum are the editions the product's available in. The good news about Express is that that's the free version. So you can go to citrix.com right now and download that. It gives you site recovery and it gives you the storage link functionality. The catch, though, is that it only gives you that functionality for 2 hosts. So, our recommendation with the Express version is to download it and test it and see if the solution from Microsoft and Citrix is the right fit for your environment. The reality is if you move into production, you're likely to be looking at it either the Enterprise or the Platinum edition. And as you can make out there, the key difference, Enterprise, of course, gives you the majority of the functionality of Storage Link. It gives you provisioning server and lab and stage manager. Actually, my mistake there. Lab and stage manager is a Platinum feature. So the key things that are in Platinum that are not in Enterprise, lab and stage manager and site recovery, as Daniel's been talking about. You can see the pricing there. These are US dollar figures, I should say. So $1,500 US is the list price for the Enterprise edition, and $3,000 US is the list price for the Platinum edition. And Daniel made a point earlier that's quite important, and that is that this is per host or per physical device licensing rather than per VM. So with that, we'll hand over to you guys. Are there any questions? Please. There you go. So the question is, what about Citrix Zen, as in Zen Server? And obviously this session is about the Essentials for Hyper-V product, building on Hyper-V, and I think it's appropriate for a lot of Microsoft customers who are going down that path. I'm happy to have an offline discussion with you about Zen Server if that's appropriate. Question there?
It really depends on the on your licensing. So if you've got a higher end or higher terabyte licensing storage at your primary site, and then lower end or smaller storage at the DR site, it's what you're licensed for. So we don't actually worry about how much data there is or how it's done. The storage vendors and the stuff that you've already bought and paid for takes care of all of that.
Yeah, of course, some of the functionality of the storage vendor will clearly require that it's the same vendor at both ends. Yeah. Question there? Yeah. So, sorry, I'll just repeat the question. Site recovery, do we cater for multiple sites being backed up essentially to a single site?
So like a one-to-many or
many to one?
Many to one. Not at this stage that I'm aware of, but as I said, there's constant developments going on. And look, as long as if your underlying storage handles that,
yes, then
Storage Link will be able to manage that.
Yeah, we'll leverage the storage functionality.
Yeah, it will leverage your storage functionality, as Pete said. So, if you've got multi-site replication already with your SAN, Storage Link doesn't really care where it goes. Yeah, it just passes through the commands.
Question there?
Yes, it does.
Sorry, what was the...
clustered shared volumes. Is that correct? Yes, it does.
Very good.
It even supports Hyper-V running CSV as well.
Cool. Any other questions? At the back there.
You mentioned before when bringing up some services again, you can set the sequence. For example, for that host, you also said you can use applications. Like, for example, check if the DNS service is up and running. How you do it, for example, if, let's say, server 2 application XYZ is dependent on...
Well, that's all managed through like Workflow Studio. So it's all done, covered through the PowerShell scripting.
Sure. we go.
Have you got to release that yet for the local storage?
Yeah, it's
Yes, Q1 next year, which is the January quarter.
Yep.
That's direct from the States.
Cool. One last question, anyone? Going? No? All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming along and appreciate your time.